Okay, I'll switch off my video. Welcome to this second iteration of the session, Republication and Duplication of Data, Authority, Identity, Ethics, and welcome. As we start, a few housekeeping notes. As Stephanie just said, we are recording this session. Please let me know if that is not okay. And then we will also ask you later again whether we can share this recording. The link to our collaborative session notes is in the chat. And please, there's a table with your names and email addresses, if you could add yourself to that, especially if you want to stay involved with this emerging activity. And another thing that I will do is I will mute everybody now to keep background noise at a minimum, which makes it easier for us all to follow. And so that's done. And now we'll jump into it. So as we start the session, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, sea, and waters of the area that we live and work on across Australia, and say that we acknowledge their continuing connection to their culture, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. We have a very simple agenda today, a few opening words and introduction, and then we have 4 lightning talks, one more on the pro-republication of data, one more on the things where we should be cautious about it. We will have one with a lens on authority and identity of the data, and one lens on credit and ethics. The second talk on the repository's perspective on republication by Robert Huber and Surya Devaraju will be given by me, because neither of them can attend this call, which is very unfortunate because this is very short notice. And I tried in the previous session to do some PowerPoint karaoke to at least present something, which I think didn't really do them justice, but it's an important perspective. So I'll try to do my best. And then we will have a discussion among the plenary, and we'll see how it works involving everybody. We will follow the chat that worked very well in the previous session to pick up topics and questions that we should discuss, and get the one or other contribution from the audience. And then, of course, there's some closing remarks, but also the question of what do we do with this? What did we learn? Does this merit another RDA activity in the form of some group, or is this birds of a feather meeting a once-off? The question that came up was that research data in a digital form can really easily be copied, then stored in multiple places and republished through more than one repository or service or portal. But that raises a number of questions, like how can humans and machines know whether they are accessing an authoritative copy of the data? How can the authoritative source or data center be attributed or acknowledged in mirror sites? Who gets credit for the used and cited data? Do we need to rethink data licensing? And what needs to be replicated in order to preserve the quality standards of the original data and the potentially rich context? So I will hand over now to Mark Hanel from Bigshare, who will look at this through the lens of a service that does do a lot of data sharing. And Mark, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Jens. Yeah, as Jens was pointing out in his great introduction, this is the second one of these of the day. I've really appreciated being able to speak to a wide audience, a global audience, on a day when everybody is locked in their living rooms. So thanks for your time. I think what I learned in the first one, we've only got 5 minutes, so I'll try and be brief by covering a few ideas. But what I learned in the first one was that it was very useful to understand when people were asking questions and when people had comments, where they were coming from and what their view and things was. So for my background and my view on this, I run Figshare. Figshare started in 2011 as a place to make my own research outputs available. And at that point, we were very bought into open data in a way that we still are, but we understand why there are things like as open as possible, as closed as necessary. We still feel that the benefits of making content openly available so anybody can do anything with the data is very important. Even though there may be some risks that people might bundle it all together and sell it. The main reason on the generalist repository that is figshare.com, our free version for that, is because we see with our State of Open Data report that lots of people, if you give them the opportunity to add restricted licenses, will. So that's the generalist repository side of things. And then the other kind of story that I wanted to tell is our other viewpoint is we are a service provider. We provide repositories for a range of different organizations, from publishers to institutions and to funders like the NIH. So there's lots of people who we are a service provider for, and that's what the story is that I'm going to be telling in the next 5 minutes. We see ourselves as helping repositories. We see the voice that I am bringing to this is usually the voice of the librarians who we're working with at the repositories who are running, and in that system we just see ourselves as the infrastructure. We build policy compliant infrastructure. So as I mentioned, we get a lot of help from the librarians, but I wanted to give the example of academic publishing and how that deals with this already, this idea of duplicating content and mirroring content, where we can learn from it and where we can maybe improve on it. So starting with Unpaywall, which I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with. So they provide a service to institutional repository managers, which is they have a library of lots and lots of files that they've pulled from lots of different locations, open access content, and they work with universities to help fill their institutional repositories. A great example of that is Carleton University. I copied and pasted this directly from their website. And so I went and had a look at Carleton University, and you can see they've got a great paper here with a great repository here with the paper available full text PDF to download. And if you compare that to the Frontiers paper, you can see that Frontiers has some extra metadata here. So I think metadata is important. And I think one of the things we're talking about in today's session is how do you make sure that you have the most full metadata? So I think that's something we can learn from. Another kind of aspect of paper publishing that we've seen is when you take this paper copy from PLOS One, you see it's duplicated in many areas. So you've got ResearchGate, you've got Science Open, all full text of the content. And then you've got PubMed Central, which is full text as well. And again, they're all serving different purposes, but in the PubMed Central case as well, is this idea of lots of copies keep stuff safe. I said in the first one, I'd love everybody to back up the Figshare content because of that meaning as well. You also see that that paper shows up in 2 of the institutional repositories. And in the one at Radboud, it gives it a handle as well. I think 1 persistent identifier per output makes things a lot easier in the data space. So I think that's a trend we can stick to. In the way that we help repositories, We do the same thing with paper repositories. So the Crick Institute will pull content from Euro PubMed Central for them. And then this is a video, if it plays, of just a little what we say about doing it for the university. We have librarians asking us for all of their data in one place. And so this is important when you look at where people are putting their data at the moment. If you look at papers that are citing data, this is tracking papers citing data in Figshare, Zenodo, Dryad, or Pangaea. What we can see is of those 20,000 data sets from last year, 1,600 of these data sets in these repositories are from the University of Oxford, 766 are from the University of Zurich. But those librarians, those universities probably want, for whatever reason, mainly probably for measuring the impact of their research that's coming out of their institution, they want to know about that data. So that's the reason behind us pulling it in. And again, this idea of the open definition, open data to be freely used, modified, and shared by anyone for any purpose, I think really, really helps us provide a good service, and other great service providers like Unpaywall do the same thing. In terms of challenges, I think it all comes down to metrics and credit and metadata. They're the two things that we need to focus on. So Make Data Count is a great project coming out of DataCite and California Digital Library, and it's all about making data a first-class research output. So when you do have things like, we have a file from Pangaea here on Figshare, you can see that it's got views, downloads, and citations. We want to normalize those views and downloads by having everybody working with Make Data Count. On the flip side, we can add information, and I think this idea of curating content, or we have examples where government repositories will take content off Figshare and improve the metadata, but we don't find out about that improvement to the metadata. So I think DataCite could play a good role as a final version, most recent, most updated version of metadata going forward, but some of that can be done programmatically, such as the citation counts here. And again, last couple of things, because time is short for me. Creative Commons is a very big, has been around for a long time and worked very well in this space. We see Figshare is actually on the examples page for CC0 and CC BY. I mentioned at the beginning, we only allow CC BY and CC0 on Figshare.com because we don't want to restrict people. We do see, so we do say there are options out there. But now, if you want to make content available as CC BY, non-commercial, places like Zenodo you can go to, and we do send people there. And last 2 points, when we talk about opinions or facts or how we do this, I think there's a lot of opinions. I think it's important to offer Todd Vision, one of the founders of Dryad, having other digital libraries voluntarily back up and promote the use of Dryad data is more of a feature than a bug. And then Todd Carpenter, the executive director of NISO, saying that maybe it's an education point. There is, when we do our state of open data, we realize that a lot of researchers don't know what CC BY licenses mean. And so I think there's a lot of education to be done. And so to round up, I want to say, when we're talking, I think an important conversation point for this discussion, and it was this morning, is whose data are they? Are we talking about the author owning them? Are we talking about the libraries owning them? Are we talking about, it's very much similar to the, do the publishers own the papers conversation? Do we want to limit the ways in which data can be used? And if so, why? And should repositories have a say in the way the content is used? And if so, why? Again, pulling back to that, whose data are they? So that's everything from me, and I'll hand back to Jens to steer.
Thank you, Mark. And I will continue with the next presentation, which is a presentation by Robert Huber and Anasuria Devaraju, who can both not join us now, but have asked me to give the presentation on their behalf. This is the data provider's perspective on the topic. And for them, it's not only the data that matters, it's also the metadata. We've heard this now already. And what Pangea emphasizes is that they have very rich metadata from their domain perspective, which they then make available for harvesting to others. And in this in these screenshots, you can see that the way the metadata are then presented in other portals is quite different, depending on what their requirements in the particular portals are. So Pangea is looking at this from a domain perspective. But certainly an important aspect of this openness around metadata is that it increases the visibility of the data. So the data then can be found through various channels, including 2 different ways of using Google: the traditional generalist search engine, Google Scholar, and also the new Google dataset search. An important aspect here is that Pangea say it should be made sure that there's proper attribution of the source and indicators of the quality of the data and metadata, because if you want to reuse data, you have to make sure that they're fit for the purpose that you're intending to using them for. So there's always a scientific purpose to it. And this is where they see the role of the domain repositories versus the generalist repositories. So in a generalist repository, you see a very general view of the data and the metadata, while in the domain context, you can add domain-specific value-add service on top of it, which then help, for instance, visualize or analyze the data and make it easier to explore what those data might mean. So that's a very brief view onto the domain perspective and domain repository perspective. And I now hand over to Leslie Wyborn to discuss the question of authority and identity.
Okay, so what I'm just going to do here is present a use case I've been working on for a couple of years with Jens. And just to give you the scene of the crime, oh sorry, the event, this concerns a set of ASTER data, which the satellite was launched in 1999, and the raw instrument data was processed L0, L1, L2 using the NASA terms. In late 2009, an Australian initiative led by CSIRO with GA and all the state surveys and a couple of other groups took 3,500 of these scenes to create this continental scale mosaic, which wasn't really ever published, but what was published was a set of 17 derivative maps, each of which was made available in 3 different formats. It's now available from 10 websites as either a whole continental coverage or broken up into 1 to 1 million map tiles. So just because I'll walk you through it. Next slide, please. I was involved with the NCI, National Computational Infrastructure, with the yellow ones down in the bottom right, and was trying to sort out, you know, what metadata do we put on the NetCDF versions of this data set that was originally, you know, produced probably 6 years before we started on it. And who do I credit, and, you know, what do I give as a source files? And I found this incredibly confused picture, and it was very hard to say, well, which is the authoritative copy, which is the original one, but more importantly, the identity of the people who had played a role in actually creating this version, which the version we had, I knew had quite a substantive history. Next slide. And just to give you an example, so this is a bit confusing. So the data set, sorry, it's a bit tight. I have redone these slides, but it obviously didn't come through. On the left-hand side, the same data set was available on the CSIRO portal as it was on this Digital Earth portal. Now you can say, well, having it on 2 websites gives you a lot more exposure and all that, but the catch was, if you look at the left-hand side, the CSIRO portal, and it's I'll tell you because you have to blow it up to see, but it gives the attribution and the citation as being Geoscience Australia, the State Geological Survey, CSIRO, etc. And another interesting, and it has a DOI on the CSIRO site. Now they've produced some product notes, and those notes are there with full citation and a DOI. When I go to the same data sets available on this website here, first of all, it says that all data on this website is now Creative Commons to Geoscience Australia. And I can come straight in here, and it's hard to actually find that were other people involved in the creation of that data set. And here's another copy of the notes, but the notes are a copy and they're available on this website, but no credit back to the original source one. And if I do dig deeper, because again, I'm coming in just using Google, I can find a metadata record, but by using Google, I can bypass the metadata record. But there's a DOI has now been put on this other data set, which is different to the one from CSIRO, even though it is the same data set. And so at least by using the separate DOIs, I know which data set I used. But to me, what's problematic is this attribution and identity, and being able to credit who did what, where, and more importantly, which organisations are still supporting this, because it takes money. And in many ways, when you look at this process, the repositories get cut out, and the repositories are the ones that have put the extra effort into creating the NetCDF versions and in maintaining and keeping them apart, keeping them going. And so I wouldn't blame a funder to come along and say, well, you clearly don't have any part in this because you're not mentioning any of the metadata. So next slide. This is where we revived something from the library because I was trying to work it out. It's an old piece of work and I won't go into it in detail. This is the product of the data versioning working group. And you end up actually saying, well, what have I got? Have I got the original work? Have I got an expression of it? Have I got a manifestation of it in a different format? And item being which location? The other clever thing that FRBR does is it allows you to separate roles. And in the modern world, these roles are part of ISO 19115, but as you can see on the right-hand side, it's the data set, who created it, who realized it, who produced it, and who owns it. And they're all very, very different, different concepts. Sorry, different roles, which you can build into your metadata. But what concerned me in this case, and I probably shouldn't just pick on DEA Australia, because I have picked up other versions of this data set sitting all over the place, and they don't credit back to the original one. You don't know whether CSIRO has done a new version of it. And yes, I'm just pointing this out, that this is the kind of practice that's going on in the web currently. And I'm sure this is not a unique case, particularly for a complex data set. I mean, we're moving beyond the stage of a researcher goes and collects a set of data and then puts it with a paper. This is data sets that are managed and resources and added to, etc. Next. So you can now come back to what I hopefully was able to do by drawing what we call the full path of data use, bearing in mind that each one of these boxes will have their own data life cycle because they're a different version. You can sort of see how I've been able to trace back, well, the NetCDF versions in yellow were derived from the green ones, and the green ones came from this project which produced the maps, and they had an original expression of all this data that was collected and managed and processed by the Japanese space system. And by having identifiers on all of them with reasonable metadata, we get the attribution and identity of all these. I mean, some are replicas, some are derivatives, and some, like that report, is a description of the data set. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. And our last presentation will now be the lens on ethics and credit. And Kira, I'll hand over to you. And I think as last time, I will forward the slides for you, and
yep,
you just tell me when.
Okay, thanks, Jens. All right, so I was asked to give the publisher's perspective here on the ethics and credit of reusing data sets. And what struck me, having some conversations internally and externally about this situation that arose on Twitter last December, was that this sort of conversation may be new to open data scene, but it's certainly not new to the idea of open content as a whole. There was a situation back in 2014 where Yahoo started selling prints of CC BY photos after acquiring Flickr, which made a lot of people who'd shared their photos on Flickr quite upset. And I thought this quote was interesting. As a photographer, I now have to choose whether to prevent people from using my photos or prevent Yahoo from selling them. I can't have both. And what struck me about this sentence is the use of the word now, as if this photographer hadn't realized before that by applying the CC BY license, they had made this choice already. Because legally, of course, it's totally fine to go and use openly licensed content in whatever way you like for whatever commercial reason. And another case that happened last year was when Knowledge Unlatched started taking open access books from various publishers, creating a resource called the Open Research Library without the knowledge or consent of any publishers, and several publishers were quite upset about this then. And I'm including this quote because I thought it was quite fun from a colleague at CUP saying, what's to stop us putting, say, Elsevier's journal's content on our platform, only partially joking. And of course, there's nothing legally to stop us. So I think what I'm getting at here is that the ethics around data reuse and republication are the same as any other reuse of open content. This is a conversation that's happened in a lot of places already. Next slide, please. So on the question of rethinking licenses, my personal view, and probably one shared by a bunch of proponents of open data, is that we use permissive licenses for good reasons. The Creative Commons licenses, as Mark pointed out, have been around for some time, and they were created intentionally to simplify and facilitate reuse of content. And as soon as we start adding license restrictions, there's a chilling effect. So non-commercial is a typical one that people might want to apply, but this actually restricts all kinds of reuse of data and other content, which may be considered, well, commercial in some jurisdictions and not in others. And the other point I'd like to make here is that community norms and ethics are distinct from licensing. So in the Flickr situation, I mean, anyone could have done what Yahoo did for many years before that. Yahoo eventually stopped doing what they were doing because it was seen as, well, one of the things that came up was it's seen as counter to the community norms and counter to expectations. And I think Dryad's argument for using CC0 licenses is still compelling, that it doesn't exempt people who reuse data from following community norms, from citing the data, from treating it ethically. So next slide. So yeah, I think Mark also raised the point of education. And I think that we sometimes avoid talking about the fact that opening up data or any other content to reuse means that anyone really can use it for any reason. And that might include reasons that we disapprove of or that we are not really comfortable with. And that's a fact that we have to face, and that's the trade-off that we make when we try to make content as open as possible for the sake of research and reuse. But it might be worth discussing how aware typical researchers are of this trade-off, and maybe it's worth having more explicit conversations about this when we promote open data so that we don't get people upset in hindsight about the way people have used their content. And next slide, yep. In terms of ethical reuse and credit, I think that there's all sorts of people can be involved in the collection and curation and sharing of data. There's the researchers and the authors of papers. There's the repositories who share the data. There are people who create backup copies and redistribute it to make it more discoverable. And I think what's ethical in these cases is making sure that people get an appropriate reward. And that might depend on what role the person has. For researchers, their interest is probably going to be in citations so that they get credit when their data is reused. And probably to them, it doesn't matter whether someone's accessed their data through Figshare or Pangea or any other repository, as long as they get the appropriate citation. Whereas from the repository or the distributor's point of view, I mean, in particular for non-profit repositories and distributors, a key way to demonstrate the value of the service they provide and the data that they hold is to demonstrate usage and traffic to their platforms. So if someone is accessing a data set that they've gone to the effort of curating and all the metadata for and putting online, if someone then goes and accesses that through a third party and they don't get any traffic, it's difficult for them to demonstrate value to funders and others who are involved. So I haven't really answered any questions there, I don't think, but just throwing out some topics of conversation that I think would be interesting around the ethics and credit related to reuse and republication of data. Thanks, Jens.
Thank you, Kira. And I will stop sharing the screen now, and that gives you the chance to see who's speaking and start the discussion. So looking at the chat, there are a couple of topics that I saw. So one was around the authoritative source. How do we recognize that? And I think that would also link to the question of how do we give credit to the original source and the value of aggregating services. And then the other set of questions is around those licenses and community norms. I would like to start with the question of the authoritative source and the original place of publication and the role of aggregating services. So Leslie, in the case of NCI, your intention was to provide a data set that had been made available by CSIRO and Geoscience Australia in a different format that would be easier to consume in machine processes. And what were the issues there between the different players involved in what was there an issue around credit or authority? Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so the first thing was, well, who owns this data set? And I ended up, fortunately, being able to dig up the original contract, and it was all explicitly stated. But again, with memory, because this is a project that was started in 2009, people had forgotten things. I also was a little bit uncertain as to, I mean, I was able to definitely sort it out. So we took what are called the BSQ files, but I didn't know what the source of the BSQ files was. Was that the copy at GA or the copy at CSIRO? It also perturbed me a bit that like the data sets sitting on the two sites and they've got different abstracts. And then the other thing that got me was the different DOIs. And so it was like the two things had grown up totally independently. And therefore I was able to eventually track what was the authoritative source and what was the copy. But the thing that also concerned me a bit was that I felt that people that had done the hard yakka in, like, to understand the project, they took 350,000 scenes and selected 3,500 and then made that L3 mosaic from which the other products were then developed. There was no attribution or credit or identity given to them that I could trace. And so what I felt was that if each one of these sequential processing levels had a DOI and a full metadata description, then you can mine it back through. You just say, like our NetCDF versions were derived from this DOI, and then we've been able to track back. But certainly when researchers are starting to want to get credit for data and funders are wanting to know, well, we funded this data acquisition, what was it used for? The current practices of just copying data, particularly where you put another DOI on it, means that this traceability is pretty hard.
So what we already heard is that there's a tension here between the different, let me rephrase it. So there are different stakeholders involved in this with different interests, and we have the researchers who want recognition for their work. We have the repositories wanting recognition for their work. We have the funders and institutions who want to measure the impact that their funding has had. Mark Heinold, you spoke on this before. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I think one thing that the data community has as an advantage over is looking back and seeing the established norms in the publication process. And I think what we were just hearing about then, and the idea of persistent identifiers for everything, make things a lot easier, along with the idea of fair data and that findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable for humans and for machines. So I think if we're looking at some of these ideas, they're made a lot easier. Obviously, a lot of these things are going to be transient things. You have ORCIDs for people, you have DOIs or other persistent identifiers for the actual object itself. And we've already talked about the idea that you should just have one. There is a versioning group as well that I know a few people are in here in this conversation are on. But then this idea of this person on this grant generated these outputs, then you can start grouping stuff together automatically. I still think that there's gaps in the system. You know, there isn't really a consistent, persistent identifier for all funders' grant information, and then, or individual grant codes, you know, they're different from funder to funder. And the other thing, as I was talking about before, is this idea of metadata. Some of the comments were talking about the authoritative version or the authoritative data set, and then everything else is seen as just a replication of that or a derivative of that. And I think that's not 100% true. You do have multiple releases of data sets, which isn't true for papers. And so what is the most up-to-date or the fullest metadata is something that I think is hard to pull through, harder to pull through than things like identifiers for everything.
Yeah, that's a good point. And so the data versioning working group that you mentioned, the work that we did there was to look at what we actually mean by a version and develop a terminology that would help us disambiguate the different things that version could mean, and then help us be clearer what we're talking about. And this distinction of, is it the same thing appearing in different places, or is it a new release? Are there significant changes? Is something that was covered in that working group. And if you're interested, blatant advertising, in about 12 hours, the data versioning working group has its final meeting, and we will present you with much more detail on that. So one thing that, sorry?
I've just put the link and the details in the chat box.
Excellent, thank you.
And I was just going to say, Jens, I saw a comment from Fiona on in the chat saying, how do we begin to define the fullest or highest quality metadata? I think that's a whole working group on its own. I think I come with questions and not with answers.
Yeah, and I mean, from my research experience, there's often a difference between the richest object and the original object. Sometimes people have put additional work into something, and even though it might then be considered to be a derivative, they have added considerable value. So it's one of the things that I started seeing in the discussion yet in the previous round and emerging in this round is that this is quite a complex landscape where we have to also start becoming clearer in our terminology of what we mean when we look at the roles and actions of different stakeholders.
Yes, this is Mark. Can I chime in?
Yes, please.
So I'm still processing, but I'm having a hard time following this conversation actually as to what, the real issues that we're trying to address. So I think it's clear that replicating data has value, if nothing else, the locks argument. But also, I think what several of our speakers have indicated is that it can enrich the data, just like you were talking about. You can add additional metadata. The complexity then comes, or the issues arise from when we replicate data. There seems to me there's two basic questions. So the authority question, how can I make sure that this is the right data, or this is the data that was used previously? I'm comparing like with like. And then the other is the credit issue. And the credit issue gets more complex because, when you add value to the data itself may have not changed, but the metadata might be a lot richer. And so you start to have a divergence between the credit and the authoritative issue in some ways, although they're still linked. And to me, the credit issue is very much a human concern. People sort of have to figure that out in terms of who are they crediting for what, and how does that benefit the human that is credited. The authoritative issue is more of a machine concern in a certain way. Is this the exact same data that was used in this application? Or is this the data that I can trust? So I think we have to think about those two issues I have to separate those issues in thinking about what the problems are and the advantages are that come from republication.
Yes, I fully agree with you that those are two separate issues. I would see them both as human issues, because a machine wouldn't care which one is the true data set. It would just process anything. But for the sake of reproducible research, it is really important to be able to know what you're dealing with.
I'd just comment as well in terms of the credit. One thing that came up on this morning's conversation around credit was I always thought of credit as being, the researcher wanting to get more credit and want to have more impact. And other people brought up the idea that sometimes repositories need to have credit in order to justify to the funders that they're fulfilling a role and things like this. So I think the idea of credit as well, that's why I was interested in people explaining backgrounds, because I think credit means different things to different folks, and the ownership of the data again means different things to different folks as well. So there's kind of, it's split in two, as you said, Mark, but also there is a spectrum across the 2 points as well.
I think that's a really good way to split it as well, like between the issues of the authoritative version versus the human issue of credit. I think in terms of ownership, I mean, once something is CC0, it doesn't legally really have ownership. I mean, there's still some rights retained by the creator, but the whole point of CC0 is to give up as much ownership as possible, right? So when you've got a CC0 data set, it really does become about community norms and ethics and what humans decide to do with it, as opposed to what they're legally allowed to do with it. And I think that's, as Mark was saying earlier, something where probably the data community can take some pointers from publications and other kinds of content where we've had these conversations, and questions of ethics and how to properly cite and give credit for the information you've used or the content you've used have been discussed.
And I think that's a really good question. In the previous round of this session, which was last night in my time zone, I called it an elephant in the room, that we're not clear in the data world yet about what the intellectual merit of creating a data set is. Because from my perspective, taking the researcher's perspective, a lot is about, the credit question is a lot about distinction. I need to get distinction. I need to be the expert in the field to get tenure, to forward and advance my career. And data, even though we want them to be first-class citizens, aren't the thing that get you tenure yet. And so to me, there's still this open question of what's the value? How does it contribute to my standing as a researcher to be the creator, originator, whatever you call it, of this data set? And that, I think, is very tightly linked to the norms around credit.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think one of the things that, so part of what we're trying to do as a publisher is to encourage people to share their data when they publish something with us. And one of the carrots we dangle in front of researchers is, if you share the data, someone will cite it, you'll get credit, you'll get recognition. This will help in, your path through academia and your career. But I think realistically, Jens, you're right that we're not quite there yet. And data, as much as we'd like it to be, isn't quite recognized as a first-class research object. So that's also a related issue that we will need to be focusing on, I think.
And then Mark Parsons, some time ago, together with Peter Fox, published a paper asking the question whether publication of data is actually the right metaphor. And Mark, I'm curious to hear how your thinking about that has evolved over the time. This paper it's a little while back. So what do you think about this issue now?
Oh, thanks for putting me on the spot there, Jens.
Sorry about that, but this is such an important topic, and the fitting paper, I couldn't avoid it.
I think probably even more than then, I don't believe that the model of how we publish articles is appropriate for how we publish data. And I think because there's very different concerns around data than there are around articles. And that isn't to say that we can't learn from the process, but it's so this conversation, I'm not really entirely clear why it's all about licensing. It is about licensing, but to me it's about norms, which I think several of the other speakers have mentioned. And sorry, processing, you really put me on the spot here, yes. But that, so this blew up out of a concern about some data being duplicated and people not getting fair credit is how I sort of interpret it. But then as people started looking at it, they realized that, wait, we have to pay extra special attention to what an authoritative data set is. And I think we're seeing that really critically in the modern world, that, you know, that we have to have good faith in what a data set is. And at the same time, we have to worry about how we give credit to the vast myriad of people that are involved in producing that data set, which is not in the same model of a lead author. There's a whole body of maintainers that are behind that data set as well. And so I think we just have to think about this a little bit differently and figure out exactly which problems we're trying to solve in this particular discussion and focus on those. You know, is it the authoritative question? Is it the credit question? Is it, I don't think it's really a licensing question. Okay, I'll stop. You put me on the spot, and that was my, my brain.
Thank you. And from what I gathered from the discussion, the licensing, asking the licensing question is the first, is a starting point, because it's codified. It's written, we can read it, we can discuss it. But as Kira already said, the issue is around the norms that we have, and that those norms are different from the legal text of the license. So I think, yes, we should focus on the norms and let those norms inform the licensing question. But the credit question, I think, really is not properly solved unless we start to disentangle the different roles, the different personas involved, and looking at what are their concerns. So a researcher's concern, data portal concern, the institutions, the funders, the data aggregators all have different concerns, and I think we will have to look at their concerns from different perspectives.
I completely agree with that. Yeah, I think the way to make this work is to make sure that everyone is treated ethically and fairly, is to understand what everyone's concerns are and make sure that everyone within the community understands how to meet those concerns. I think trying to enforce it through licensing is never going to be a viable option, really. And it does have to be about really understanding those concerns.
Yeah, I think from my experience, just noticing recently, and I'm glad you mentioned the word portals, Jens, because some of those portals with web services are starting to become a real problem, because they are just providing links to data, direct to the data, bypassing the metadata. And then when you go and look at the portal, it says all data on this portal is CC by to a particular organisation. Now, I think that's an unintentional consequence of what they're doing, but it is very frustrating because, you know, I go to a few portals and there's data there coming from our site and you wouldn't even know it's coming from there. So and why people are using it without, as you said, having the concerns about, like, is it Julie you've put in, I'd want to know source of my data. Well, yeah, so do I, but not everybody does.
Well, one example that we heard yesterday was about a portal from a larger European project, or was it an international global project? I can't remember, but about atmosphere, I think it was atmospheric CO2 data that aggregated data from many different repositories. And well, we don't hear the term one-stop shop much anymore, but it's the thing that everybody wanted. You didn't want to go to 30 portals to get your data. You wanted to go to one and get the one big compilation, and then that practice would bypass all the involved repositories. And so that how do we set up a system that gives justice to the different players involved? Mark Haenel, you mentioned the Make Data Count project. If I understood correctly, that project is trying to address some of those questions.
I think it's more trying to address the questions of quantified metrics. So if one of the concerns is that by having a data set available in multiple places, making sure that everybody who is appropriate is getting credit, who should be getting appropriate credit, whether it's the author or authors, whether it's the repository, whether it's the government. And so if that data is found, like those papers I demonstrated were found on 6 different places, you get a cumulative score on their views and their downloads, so you can compare apples for apples. And so I think that's a step forward. I think some of the stuff since Mark spoke, and then hearing a little bit about what we were hearing from Leslie is around authoritative copies. And I find this idea of authoritative copies a strange concept, and the idea that, I mean, Leslie's example was fantastic, so that's one use case, but I'm imagining for a more generic use case of a researcher saying, I'm publishing a paper in Nature and they've told me to make the data behind this publicly available. If that's in a Springer Nature data repository, or if it's in Zenodo, or if it's in a subject-specific repository, you probably, as a researcher, don't know much about the differences that between them. And so being indicative about some kind of badging system there that I think we'll get to with fair data will really help understand. I don't think the concept is authoritative. I think it's understanding what you're getting from that data set. And obviously you do need to have the provenance to say this was originally published in the Springer Nature repository or what have you, but understanding that this has been checked, that this is reproducible to get all the way down there. I think that's where I think the gaps are in the space right now that are not being addressed. I think Make Data Count is a fantastic example of like an obvious gap that we can see with things like ORCID filling up obvious gaps, right? I know there was researcher ID and things like that before, but an obvious gap. And so I'm interested in understanding where are these other obvious gaps. I think the idea
I can think of one right from that Making Data Count issue. That's well, great and good for a set of data that goes with a paper. Almost all data I'm aware of doesn't fall into that category. Maybe it does for Figshare. Most data have long time series and maybe 23 papers associated with them. And I'm not sure how one compares the single download of the entire Modis Mod 10A1 data set with 100,000 downloads of some little itty bitty spreadsheet. I mean, seriously, the scales are orders of magnitude different.
Yep, I agree. I think that for me,
we have researchers who use multiple of those big data sets.
Yeah, I think there's the reuse, and that's why I think the citation is always the key metric for content in data as things stand at the moment. There's some work that's going on in papers in terms of this is my data set. You need to that backs up my findings, or I am using someone else's data. I think that split is important as well that we haven't got to. But do you think citations will cover that, or do you think there's still usage metrics that we're not quantifying in a good way?
I think NASA spent 30 years trying to come up with a standard way of doing the metrics that the Make Data Count folks are trying to do right now, and failing because they discovered that really they were trying to measure apples, oranges, pineapples, cars, and the sun.
It would make sense for NASA to try and measure the sun. So what did they is it just seen as a lost cause and we can't quantify data, or is it
no?
Data?
They do quantify it, but it's very domain specific, and repositories basically have to describe what it is they can do and are doing. And they also come at it from the other direction of doing, you know, what does the user community think? So
Right.
it is both directions. For example, 6 million web downloads of, you know, a really high level data product that depends on a few petabytes of data stored somewhere, is probably, worth more than, some other things. But you can't treat them all the same because they're not all the same.
Right. And I think
Bruce's basic point is that the classic scholarly use of citing data in a paper is an important but very small example of how data are used. And so when we're thinking about the concerns around authority and credit, that's only a partial concern, is how we do it in a paper.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in terms of what we consider the authoritative data set, it kind of depends on what you want to use it for. Like if you're looking to investigate the data that underpins a particular research finding that's reported in a paper, what you want is exactly the data set that that person used for that particular project, right? But if you want to carry out novel research, then you might want an updated data set or a newer version or something with the enriched metadata that a repository or a portal has added in the future, rather than the original version. You want to have that enriched newer version.
And if you want to save people's lives and you don't care one whit about research, and you use a data set that's hot off the presses without any quality control, and you manage to succeed in saving 60 lives, I think that counts higher than any of the research stuff.
Mm-hmm. I think that the idea of badging there, I don't have a solution for badging, but we've seen it recently with bioRxiv going from no mention of the fact it's a preprint repository and it's not peer reviewed, to obviously a lot of pickup in the COVID world, and they put on the papers now that this is not peer reviewed. It doesn't mean that it's not any use, and people are using it because it's bleeding edge, and I think data is very much more leaning towards that. But I think indicative, more metadata around provenance and ideas of where the content has come from can really help move that conversation on.
And to follow up on that, Mark, I think, so to try and move the group forward, I think we're starting to get passionate, which is good, but then I think what would be really useful maybe is some guidelines or on things to think about when republishing data. And I don't know that we can really, we either have to pick out a chunk that we want to focus on, what's a specific aspect of the authority question or the credit question. But I think what we're saying is that there's some broad community norms that we want to try and establish, things to think about when you're republishing data is kind of where I'm coming.
So Mark, I sat through last night's call, and also, as you know, we've been running this versioning group for 2 weeks now, for 2 years. Excuse me. And I would argue that what you're saying is, do we need a working group on best practices for publishing research data on the web? Because that would cover republishing and, again, these pitfalls that are happening with the portals. Like, I'm sure that use case I've pointed out between the two sites, they wouldn't even have thought about it because they were so keen to increase the usage and uptake of the data, but these are the consequences of what they've done. And I think if people knew that these could be the consequences, which is what you're saying, they might consider things a bit more carefully.
Just thinking, Leslie, were you not trying to give up working groups before?
No, I'm making the suggestion. I'm not saying I'm doing it.
Right. Leslie's volunteered. That's good.
No,
I was wondering, and others that have, but just based on what Mark was saying, would a kind of white paper make sense as a good starting point, or would that be defined as one of the outputs we go for from the working group?
Actually, I was thinking that perhaps some of these user stories that are not the normal, you know, old-fashioned, use a little bit of data in my paper, but are some of these other kinds of stories, like the example that Leslie gave, or I have several similar examples. And
Yeah, I think
part of that,
Ruth, I agree with you. I think that there is this norm, particularly now that the publishers are insisting that the data sets are being made available. It's just appealing to the long tail, which is the bulk of the researchers, right, who are doing this linear. I've collected this data and here's my paper on it. The reality is NSF and other groups keep funding these major repositories that are aggregating data. This is an emerging issue. And yeah, if we could, like, that's how, again, if you look at the, here we go, advertising, in the data versioning one, when we got that rolling, we ended up with 39 documented use cases. And then from that, we wrote a white paper, which is just, well, this is what we think is the best practices. So whether you could use the same model, you know, best practices in publishing complex data on the web. And no, I don't want to do it.
Yeah, that was what I was thinking about before as well, with the idea of the funders being the driver for a lot of this now. I think trying to encourage researchers to make data available in that very, you have to make your data available because of a publication. I think it will move much further along towards the, everyone will just have to do it because their funder tells them. And that'll count for little projects that, projects that you're publishing lots of papers on, or massive big projects that have got very complex issues, and then trying to normalize how we treat those different cases and how people are going to be measured on them. And this idea of credit is going to be really important going forward as well. I think that's that spread is probably the most important thing coming out of this.
Yeah, well, there's certainly a group coming around, which is why some of the repositories that are putting all the effort to do the metadata, the curation, keeping track of changes of the data sets are really getting worried, because the more people reproduce a data set somewhere on Amazon or a cloud store somewhere, then the funders say, well, what do we need these big expensive repositories for?
Yeah, and I mentioned that this morning as well, this idea that the difference between just our own personal stories with this, you know, with figshare.com being a free, generous repository that just gets checked for, anyone can go and use it, and it just gets checked for this looks academic and it's not spam, basically, is the check that gets, compared with the NIH repository, which uses our infrastructure, but it's a completely separate repository, and it has curation, it has metadata improvement, and they've done some analysis that it does help with that. I think emphasizing those points to the funders is really helping, and we have some people with funder experience on the call. The funders realize the importance of that, the steps to FAIR, you know, the starting with findable and accessible and then moving towards interoperable and reusable costs money. And that is I think that is only going to strengthen the case of subject-specific repositories and the curation that goes on there, because, you know, ideally everything would have a subject-specific repository. And 70% of researchers find that some of their stuff can't go into subject-specific repositories. So one day, hopefully we'll have a subject-specific repository for everything that is funded, and the curation is funded, and these repositories and these data librarians are funded in that way. So I do think that providing evidence for the funders for that is coming.
And the other thing to emphasise, of course, is that it takes specialist skills, which is another thing that often escapes people's attention.
Mm-hmm.
I'm getting on a hobby horse here. Get off it, Leslie.
So looking at the time, we should start thinking about what do we want to do. It's quite obvious to me that this is not a once-off BoF, that this should transform into something else. The question is, where do we want to take it?
And more importantly, who would like to lead it and bring it together? And so if you look at the notes, okay, we've got the table set up with your attendance, and we've added a column, and the column is whether you would like to be interested in it. Now, first of all, I see only 8 of you have filled it in, and there's 37 on the call. So can you do something about that, please? And then if you look, Ming's added a column. What did you call it, Ming? And you can see who was on the call last night. Yeah. What would you like your level of future involvement to be? And we haven't got a single one. Oh yeah, we've got a 1. But if you just, it'd be good if you could fill it in. They were much better last night because we had 86 on the call and 71 filled it in. You lot are pretty bad. Oh, sorry about that.
No, Leslie. We have we have 2 split tables now because there are there are about 20 people filled in, 22 people filled in the table for this call, and some people filled to the previous table. So we're all good.
Okay, sorry about that. Change feet. Yeah. Anyway, so let's be wishful and go back to talking about what we can do. But if someone doesn't step forward as the leader, it won't go very far. Oh, that's being dismal.
So I think this is a really important topic, and so I want to drive this forward. And I think just looking at the list, there are a couple of people who have already raised their hand that they would join leading this task. So I think, yes, it's something that we will put together over the next few days to coordinate that. Would we make this an interest group, or would we work towards another BoF session? I don't think a working group is the right vehicle now, because we're not really clear what exactly we want to achieve. So looking at the data versioning group, I think that was a classical RDA work group activity life cycle, starting from a discussion in different working group that highlighted things that needed to be resolved, that was discussed in a BoF. The BoF resulted in an interest group, and then the interest group focused the topic to a degree that we had something that we could work on and achieve an output within the 18 months that are the kind of life cycle for a working group. And that's what I propose here to, I think it's evident that from this BoF something should follow, but we're not at the point where we can task a working group. But an interest group would be, from my perspective, the right vehicle to prepare further activities.
I mean, I would tend to agree with that. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah, you can vote yes or no if you click on the participants panel. There is a voting.
Yeah, that's a good idea. That gives us a show of hands now, but you can also put your name in the table and in the collaborative notes and indicate your level of involvement.
So to put you on the spot, Jens, give me a 2-sentence summary of what this interest group would do.
So, as a spontaneous 2-sentence elevator pitch, I'd say the question of sharing data through different channels raises questions around credit and data authority, and the interest group should look at what questions that raises with respect to community norms, and collect user stories to then distill the main questions. And I think answering those questions, that would be something that a working group could do.
Okay, that was pretty good.
Are there any other voices that we haven't heard yet? So I would then, to start wrapping up this session, ask the panelists for a few closing words. Who wants to go first?
This is Mark. I'm just going to say thanks for a great session over the 2 sessions. I think the first one, we laid down some good baselines and we started to pull on the bits that really should be followed up on. So I think the ideas that Jens put forward are great. Happy to be a part of it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, also thanks from me for a great discussion. I've really enjoyed this. I think it's a really interesting topic and would also like to be involved as we take it forward. Yeah, I think what I'm particularly interested in is the question of how we make sure that all the different people who have different roles in creating and sharing data get the appropriate credit when that data is reused and reshared and republished. Thanks.
And it's great. It's great that RDA has managed to carry on and be so international with everyone being remote. So thanks for everyone coming along.
I guess my comment would be, because here we go, I've got to stay up again until 10 o'clock tonight to do the data versioning working group, right? And that is definitely finishing up. And we've kind of, the last couple of plenaries, been floating around ideas as to what we could do for the next phase. And so maybe when we talk to those guys tonight, we can say that this is something that's clearly a burning issue, and could the 2 groups combine and start to move on with something else? Because the consensus of that group was that we needed to keep something going on versioning, that although we've got these best practices now defined, there's still a lot more that's not understood. And what these 2 meetings last night and this morning, sorry, I'm in Australian time zone, has shown us that probably this is the next most burning issue on versioning. and that is the relationship of the roles and the identities, etc.
Yeah, thank you,
that's
Leslie.
A suggestion.
Yeah, I agree with you. This might be a good way forward. Before we end the session, there's a question whether the recording of the earlier session will be available, and I would like to ask you whether you want to make the recording of this session available. The default is yes. If you have concerns, please do let me know. But if there are no objections, we will make the recordings of both sessions available. There's a very late question about the Shark IG, which I'm not familiar with. Catherine, if you quickly want to say something about that.
I don't know if I'm unmuted. I don't know anything about it, but it's called Sharing Rewards and Credit Interest Group. And I just saw that it was on the schedule. I'm not sure if I can attend that, but it just occurred to me that there's a potential overlap, either certainly in the names, but it's talking about seeking to unpack and improving crediting and rewarding mechanisms in the data resources sharing process. So just the concept of credit.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you for pointing that.
Oh, no, you're welcome.
Thank you very much. This is very relevant. We have to, this is one of the things that this nascent group has to do to check what other activities are going on. This is a very dynamic field.
And I'm one of those people who I'm looking to get back more involved in the RDA, and there are a lot of different possibilities. I'm sitting through a bunch, and then we'll circle it back around and see how it all fits together.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay. Thank you very much to all the speakers. Thank you very much for attending at whatever time it was in your day. I'm sorry that we couldn't meet at RDA in person. At least we could meet online. And I think this is a format we will have to get used to, and that we will evolve further. And I hope that we will get the chance to meet in person again sometime in the not too distant future. So thank you very much again for all your contributions to the discussion, and have a great day, evening, morning, night, whatever your time zone is. And thank you for sharing your ideas and joining us, and see you again in one of the other virtual plenary sessions. We will copy the chat notes into the document to make it available for everyone, and yeah, we'll keep you posted. Thank you.
Thanks, Jens.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
And thanks, everyone.
Bye.